This is the humble rung. The business consultant at the table next to me at Coffee Culture waxes on about how he only deals with top executives, about profits and margins, and seems like he's really pouring it on thick for the fella he's meeting with. Gross revenues, numbers of employees, big figures were being hurled around by both fellas like two cowboys lassoing wild horses. But a moment occurs. The consultant asks, "What was your total revenue last year?" The man pauses. 2,500, he says. 25 what? 2,500. The consultant desperately fumbles around to find the eject button, as if by proximity alone, he too would be brought down to this man's lowly place. In fact, there was a moment where he literally gasped for oxygen, while evidently trying to still appear interested. Witnessing the plane crash of a conversation left me, and undoubtedly the hurting businessman, dripping with what it feels like to look up from the bottom at all those who play above our station in life. I had a similar thing happen recently where a wealthy, influential guy had me foaming at the mouth, promising to donate the moon and the stars to our charity. Up until the moment he realized I had no contacts that I would give him to be potential investors in his company. Where once there were sweet nothings, now only the gong of silence as my emails go unanswered. I was left contemplating life's humble rung. I like the notion of taking a low place until it requires genuine humility. That elusive capacity to know our worth despite experiencing these hierarchical demotions of one stripe or another. Sometimes we like the humble rung because we can sit there hurling stones. But the humble rung of love isn't a place of comfortable cynicism. It usually smarts at first, as if whacking your head off a low-hanging doorway. But it's a place that's better to get used to sooner than later, because life is not always going to hold our seat for us. Do we not each have a radio wave-like honing device that picks up on anything that would elevate or drop our social ranking? Leaving the Amway party, do you feel that woman's comment about how nice it must be to be a stay-at-home mom, pecking on your central nervous system, making short work of the rest of your evening? Having someone unsubscribe from your MailChimp updates. Are we not these social animals wired to constantly calculate? Status is trending, rising. Okay, a slight dip, dipping. Status is in a free fall. We've landed on that snake. Be good to the people on the way up the ladder because you need them on the way down, says my friend Lucky. Remember that the next time that person you admire bounds across the room to greet the person behind you.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. Always an amazing way of helping us understand social hierarchies. Hierarchies, why do we have them? I mean, as Glenn has so deftly pointed out, we live in a world of hierarchies, whether it's formal hierarchies of institutions or organizations. We oftentimes find our place in those at the lower end, and as Glenn's pointed out, there's often much more subtle nuances to the social hierarchies we experience every day in life, knowing our place in the pecking order. It's interesting to me because I think we always try to keep those subtle, except at weddings. Weddings are fascinating to me because it's the one time in life where you basically say, I'm going to rank all of my friends and family. And it starts right with the wedding party, right? You're my best man. The rest of you, good friends, but you're going to have to stand a little further down the line. And then, of course, the table, the seating, you know, and so there's always that. Have you ever showed up to a wedding and you're at the back table and you're just like, oh, clearly I know where I stand in the pecking order of things. I want my gift back. I've been doing weddings for a long time now, and I'm always amazed because one of the great things about being able to do weddings is I can kind of take myself out of the pecking order. And I was doing this wedding a couple of years ago, and it was a good friend of mine. And as we were preparing for the wedding, he said that all of his groomsmen were going to have belts with superhero buckles on them. And I was like, okay, that's cool. That's creative, interesting idea. So the groomsmen show up. It's about 5 minutes before the wedding. And all of his groomsmen, he's Superman. His best man, I think, was Batman, Spider-Man, Green Lantern, I think, was there. They had these belt buckles. And 5 minutes before the wedding, he says, Brad, I've come to really appreciate you, and I want you to feel like one of the guys. So I got you a belt buckle, too. I'm hoping that you'll wear it. Now, this annoyed me on 2 levels. The first is that I got Thor, which I'm not a big comic book person, but Thor seems pretty low on the totem pole, right? Like, run around with a stupid hammer. It seemed ridiculous to me. The second issue was this. It's 5 minutes before the wedding. He gives me this belt that I have to wear, and you might be able to tell the problem. I'm left going, are you serious? I have to wear this belt up there. So 5 minutes before, I'm like, okay, I gotta do this for my friend here. And like, I'm up there doing the wedding as Thor, the portly pastor here. I mean, it was ridiculous. I hate that. I felt like, oh, such an idiot, this low guy on the totem pole. Social hierarchies are so fascinating to me, the way we rank each other. And it's interesting. What do we attribute that to? I mean, different fields of study, they sort of all have their own little theories about why our world is governed by hierarchies. But evolutionary psychology has a very interesting, much more primal theory. Remember, according to evolution's understanding of the world, human nature is driven by the need to reproduce, to get our genes into the gene pool, you could say. This is our fundamental biological drive, to mate and reproduce. And so, in terms of the question of hierarchies and power, evolutionary psychology's answer is very simple. The mating marketplace is competitive, and so to be successful in propagating your DNA, you must do something to help yourself stand out from the pack. Essentially, as humans, we will use whatever means possible or necessary to climb the mating ladder. And so if power makes you high on the hierarchy list, then you chase that. If it's money, then you chase that. If it's charm or beauty or whatever, you chase those things. Life is about getting our genes into the gene pool. And whatever tools will help me achieve that, that's the things we pursue. And so hierarchies, according to evolutionary psychology, were intended to be a simple system to help regulate who gets to mate with who. And let me illustrate this all, different ways of looking at things. On the morning of Wednesday, January 21st, 1998, Americans woke up to breaking news. The Washington Post was reporting allegations that President Bill Clinton had an affair with a 24-year-old White House intern, the woman we would come to know as Monica Lewinsky. Now, on that January morning, no one had any idea that this would turn into this year-long political scandal, complete with, the famously stained blue dress, tales of cigars, and, of course, Bill's famous refrain, "I did not have sex." That sucked. I can't do Bill. He did not have sexual relations with that woman. But, by the year's end, he confesses that he does, and he becomes the very first ever elected president to be impeached in American history. The nation was in shock. And the question on everyone's mind was this: why on earth would the most powerful man in the world jeopardize his job for an affair with this young woman? Why would you risk all that power for some momentary pleasure? It seemed to make no sense. And yet, for Darwinian historian Laura Betzig, she recalls in one of her writings waking up that morning and saying to her friend, "I told you so." For Betzig, you see, the question wasn't, why would you risk it all for an affair? The question for her was, why wouldn't you? See, Laura Betzig has spent 20 years chronicling the behavior, reproductive habits of the most powerful men in history, and her results show that those on top of hierarchies throughout human history consistently obtain high reproductive success. And so, according to evolutionary psychology, most of what we do is unconsciously motivated by reproductive strategies. Whether it's running for office, like Bill, looking for a raise, trying to complete that degree, that higher position at the office, it's all about reproductive access to a larger number of women for men, and for women, access to better, more powerful men. For evolutionary psychology, reproductive success is the goal. Political power, monetary power, intellectual power, all of these are but means to an end, you could say. And so to ask why the President of the United States would have a sexual encounter with a young woman is akin to asking why someone with lots of money would spend it. The purpose of earning money is to spend it. The purpose of becoming president or climbing any hierarchical ladder is to use your place to find more mating opportunities. Interesting theory, isn't it? Next time you're thinking about going for that promotion, you're like, hey, is this about mating opportunities? I don't know. You might ask, though, how successful has this strategy been? If this is true, how successful has it been? Well, consider this. What person in history has verifiably had the most children? Glad you asked. Because that honor apparently goes to a man, I never heard of him before this week. That honor goes to a man named Mulai Ismail the Bloodthirsty. That's quite the moniker. Now, by chance, what kind of man would we expect Mulai to be? Might he be a normal, average Joe, kind, next-door neighbor kind of guy? I'm thinking his name probably gives away the answer. No, he wasn't an average, ordinary guy. Mulay was the second ruler of the Moroccan Alouette dynasty. He reigned for 55 years between 1672 and 1727. And his bloodthirsty moniker seems appropriate because in order to intimidate rivals, we're told, he ordered that his city walls be adorned with the skulls of 10,000 of his enemies. It's estimated during his reign he killed 30,000 people of his own people. And interestingly enough, this man with immense power happened to father 867 children. Though many think the actual number is well over 1,000. Odd, isn't it? A man with incredible power happens to hold the record for most children fathered in the world. Or consider this. According to a recent report from the University of Leicester, more than 800 million men living today, and remember, that's just men, 800 million men today descended originally from just 11 men, including the ruthless Mongolian leader Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is thought to have fathered hundreds of children during his lifetime. Now, scientists believe that there might actually be 16 million of his male descendants today. Now, what do I know? How these scientists made this discovery is well beyond my understanding. I'm just reporting to you what I'm thinking. But from what I can gather, geneticists have been able to find 11 distinctive sequences in Y chromosomes, the chunk of the DNA that's only carried by men. And what they did is they took a sample of 5,000 men in Asia, their sample. They traced these male lineage back to 11 sources, or their approximate founding fathers. And what this means is that 800 million men today, or 1.6 billion people, if we add in women, came from just 11 men. And they're not sure of the identities of these men, but you can see from the map where they think these 11 men came from. Genghis Khan's for sure one of them. They have suspicions about who the other ones are. But I'll let you in on a not such a big surprise. They happen to think all of these men were incredibly powerful, incredibly rich. Surprise, surprise. The human goal, according to evolutionary psychology, is reproductive success. And what they would say is that the strategy is at work within us consciously, but most often unconsciously, and everything else, power, money, fame, intellect, all those things are just means to an end. Intriguing little theory, isn't it? Hierarchies exist as a ranking board for mating, you could say. If you're at the top or near the top, reproductive success is virtually guaranteed. Find yourself at the bottom and, well, history won't remember your name. Now, into this plot, into this stage setting, cue Jesus stage right. And hopefully by now in this series, you've come to understand from my point of view that I've come to see Jesus as sort of this missing link between the human and divine. He represents the next step in our evolutionary journey, you could say. If you are here and you find evolution or its psychology in any way authoritative or interesting, then I believe you could frame Jesus' message very simply this way: it's time to evolve. It's time to evolve. Jesus, you could say, came to show us how to evolve by subverting our evolutionary impulses. Because here's the thing. Whether you believe hierarchies exist as a mating strategy or simply as a system of power dynamics or something else, it doesn't really matter. Hierarchies are a fact of life. But when Jesus shows up on the scene, he announces the rules of the game have changed forever. Take a look at how some of the ways Jesus' life is explained, some of the stories he told, and you'll start to get an idea of what I'm talking about. I think Jesus comes to replace hierarchies with humility. This is from Philippians 2. This is Paul describing Jesus, first talking to the Philippian church. He says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name." Notice the progression here. And I'm not going to try to explain today the Christian Trinitarian understanding of God. That'll have to wait for another day. But notice what happens here. In God, there's an equality of parties. Jesus lowers himself, made himself nothing, takes the form of a servant, and because of that, God then exalts him. What does that mean for us? In a world of hierarchies where the game is simply to become high in status, Jesus changes the rules and he announces this: those of us with power, privilege, pedigree, you now have to lower yourselves on the hierarchy, because the people who go low are the ones who truly have status in the kingdom. Or consider Jesus at his Last Supper discourse in John chapter 13. Read this. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, so he's high on the hierarchy list, and that he had come from God and was returning to God, so he got up from the meal and announced his decrees as king. No. What does he do? He gets up from his position of power, takes off his outer clothing, wraps a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, rightly so, for that's what I am. And now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Exact same algorithm here. High status to low status. The way of Jesus is to completely invert hierarchies. The high on the ladder are only really high if they climb back down it. Or Jesus tells plenty of stories. This is one of my favorite ones, Luke 14. He's at this party and he notices that all the guests are looking for the best place. We read this. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. "When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, 'Give this person your seat.' Then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place." Notice Jesus make a very important distinction here. Humiliation is being forced into a lower position. Humility is volunteering for it. He moves on. "When you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, 'Friend, move up to a better place.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled. All those who humble themselves will be exalted." Jesus comes to replace hierarchies with humility. He comes to show us a more evolved way of living, eschewing our places in hierarchies. And he tells stories, and there's teachings about him that demonstrate this. In a world of hierarchies, it's not the last, the least, and the little that have anything to do. It's those of us with high status that must act in low status ways. That's a pure moral demonstration. Interestingly enough, for the very first Christians, how these teachings, these ideas played out for them was fascinating. We get this in Ephesians 5:21. How did this play out for the first Christians? Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Total inversion of our natural impulses. The next step of evolution is when hierarchies are replaced by humility and when success is supplanted with submission. And when you travel the path of love, which I think all of us are on here, we're in the wilderness deep now on the path of love, eventually we come face to face with a specific challenge, and it's this: can we walk the path of humility and submission? And this is where things get interesting for me, because generally, right, when we think about humility, we assume that it means thinking less of ourselves. We think humility should involve some kind of, I should think badly about myself, or it means I should think less of my self-value or self-worth. But when I consider these passages we've looked at, I suggest that it's exactly the opposite. Because it's only a person with a strong sense of self-value and self-worth who can be expected to volunteer to lower themselves. For humility to be an act, a moral act, a demonstration of love, it must act from strength. Because if humility is born out of fear or low self-esteem, it's not humility, it's humiliation, and no one in God's kingdom should be humiliated. Humility isn't so much, you could say, about how we think of ourselves or how often we think of ourselves. Humility is how do you deal with, how do you behave in hierarchies? Remember when I worked at Chapters, bookseller there, and we had an incident one day that I'll never forget. Me and my fellow bookstores, I was about medium on the scale. There were lots of people there who'd been working longer than me, but there was a few who had just started a couple weeks, couple months ago. And news began going around the store that something awful had happened in the washroom. And as we went to investigate, I will try to paint a very tame vision here, but somebody had had a big issue in the bathroom. I was concerned for them. It was a disgusting mess, not just in the toilet, around, like it was just bad. And I remember us workers looking around like, someone's going to have to clean this up. I remember we sort of scampered around the store, everyone sort of, well, I got to get a book for a customer or something, right? And then so it happened. Dom was our manager. And I still remember him coming out of the office with the plunger. And all of us looking at each other like, oh no, who's going to be tasked with this? It was funny, he went to the new guy, said, I need you to do something. And I remember the new guy was like, you don't pay me enough for that. Like, I think minimum wage was like $6.85 at the time or something. You don't pay me enough for that. Which really emboldened the rest of us, right? Like, whoa, if the new guy's saying no, then I'm not taking it. And remember, Dom was having a hard time finding anyone, so he asked everyone to line up, employees. So we lined up and he had the plunger. Are you going to clean it? Nope. 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 Me. Oh boy. I'm not one to just say no. I like to have sort of the reason. So I remember being, Dom, I make $6.85. This is a janitor's job. This is not, I sell books. That's my specialty, like you need to know. That's what I do, Dom. I am not going to do it. I remember everyone down the line said no. And poor Dom, with the plunger over his shoulder, heads into the bathroom to clean it up. It's fascinating because in that moment, what I had done is said, my lowly book selling associate status is still apparently higher than janitor or something like that. And here's the interesting thing. Evolutionary psychology would say of my reaction, my saying no, it would say this: of course, that's perfectly natural and appropriate. Assuming the role of cleaning toilets would greatly diminish your reproductive potential. Now, I have to confess at the time, not cleaning the toilet didn't seem to help my reproductive potential either, but I digress. Here is what I think I would say that Jesus would say of my reaction. I think Jesus would say to me this: first, receive grace because you really need it, Brad. But second, your reaction, Brad, is so typically human. It's so cliche. Surprise, surprise. You didn't want to take the low status position, and by not, you missed out on a divine opportunity. You missed out on an opportunity to experience what it feels like to be God. And it's interesting to me because in churches, inevitably, I end up hearing conversation about experiencing God. We want to experience God, and we look for that feeling in nature or in music or in powerful teaching. I want to experience God. And I can't help but think this: if you want to experience God, then volunteer for a low position. That's about as divine as it gets. That's the way Jesus showed us. God volunteers for the low status roles. If you want to really experience God, it won't be found in music, it won't be found in great teaching, it won't be found in nature. You know what will be found? Volunteering for low status stuff. And on that day, I missed that opportunity at Chapters. As my good friend Bono would say, you want to kiss the sky, you better learn how to kneel. On your knees, boy. And I missed that opportunity that day. Or consider submission, how it plays out in the context of Jesus' first followers. The earliest Christians talked about mutual submission. And yikes, I get it, right? The word submission for some of us is enough to make us like, I'm heading for the doors. Submission has this real bad rap these days, and so it should. When we force submission upon anyone, another human being, it's humiliating. That has no place in God's kingdom. What God is after is not humiliation, but humility. The idea of forced submission is awful, but that's not what Paul is getting at in Ephesians 5. It's voluntary, mutual submission. The path of love that Jesus calls us to, remember, is this: passive, non-coercive love. And so it is with submission. Passive, non-coercive submission to others. But even still, right, the word submit is a tough word. And again, evolutionary psychology would say never submit. It makes no sense. To forgo all power, it makes absolutely no sense at all. In a competitive mating marketplace, the people who win out, they don't submit. But I think Jesus says to us, you're more than an animal. You're more than your biological drives. You're more than the sum of your evolutionary impulses. Reach your destiny, eschew power, eschew privilege, eschew pedigree. Evolve into what I've always created you to be. Learn to submit to God, to your community, to others. That's the highest path of love one can travel. And the interesting thing is we understand this in art and music and movies, right? Every time you go to the theater, what are you doing? You're saying, I'm going to submit to the film. I'm going to suspend belief. I'm going to suspend my cynical nature, my power position that wants to critique it. I'm going to submit to the movie and allow me to take it somewhere. Or think about music, right? What we do here on Sunday mornings. There's different ways to approach music here. It can be from a power perspective, which says, I'm going to critique the way the music's done. I'm going to critique what the message is saying, or I'm going to submit to the music, allow it to move me. We get this in music, movies, art. We must submit in order to get the most out of the experience. What does this mean? Well, let me ask Glenn to come again, give us another reading, because all of this can become very impractical. It can sound a bit abstract. And so what I want to try to do for us is try to make it profoundly practical. And so what I want to do is present us with a litmus test that will help us gauge, I think, our levels of maturity in terms of submission and humility by asking this one question: how interruptible are you? Glenn?
On being interrupted. Just as the lights dim and the show begins, I hear it. The crinkling of a chip bag, evidently sealed too tight for the impish little man next to me. Then his stubby but pesky little fingers start fiddling with the wrapper of a pack of nibs. The sound crackles out through the crowd, unnerving me, as if listening to the sound of mice in the walls at night. I start pacing back and forth inside myself. The crinkling acts as some sort of dog whistle on me, and I'm either going to end up in the fetal position or I'm going to bite his forearm. Then he starts with what I would call animalistic chewing. Soon every nerve is barely hanging on like a clawed cat sliding down a tin roof. I sit there in the darkness feeling provoked by this creature of sound, as if I'm being goaded into a drunken bar fight. Next time he smacks his lips, I just want to and feel relief rush in like insulin. The disdain I have for someone coming to the door is disturbing to me. The other day I felt disgusted with myself for my attitude towards having to get up off the couch and walk all the way to the front door. The ordeal of tearing myself away from my laptop. My task can become like a deity. Sitting in my living room with one eye on my visiting relative and the other sneaking a cross-eyed peek at the email I'm trying to write while they're not looking. That instinct of recoiling when you see a certain name on your call display. Letting it go to voicemail. The eventual callback and that conversation that grates on you like a palm sander. That invitation to one more birthday party at your Romanian neighbor's house. The older gentleman with the slight tremor, softly and slowly describing the weather to the bank teller. The weather that we can all see through the window while we wait in line. Those footsteps you hear from down the hall that you know so well. Before they arrive at your office, you conjure up a busy look that will hopefully be enough to ward off one of his lingering visits. But no, he's now in the doorway summarizing his weekend in a storytelling format. Inside, you fantasize about ramming your head into a stud in the drywall. And how many small groups have there been in which I find myself desperately hoping for the time to expire, because a man is speaking in a looping style in which the repetition acts as a kind of conversational flogging. My guarded, precious time. And then I meet someone who is clearly viewing conversation with me in the same way. Looking over my shoulder, eyeing the person he'd like to be talking to. Have you ever slipped down several rungs on a ladder? The terrifying humility of falling, pulling muscles in the forearms, trying to stop the slip, scraping the shins, and finally the hard relief of the bottom, where we join so many who are now looking up at those above us. Be good to the people on your way up the ladder, because you need them on the way down.
Thank you, Glenn. He sent me that reading this week, and I couldn't help but remember me having a bag of nibs next to you in the theater. I couldn't be sure if it was me he was referencing. Now I'm very sure, and I'm feeling a little insecure there, Glenn, about my movie snacking habits. That's all right. This is the reality, though. To be the kind of person who embraces interruptions in life is the very definition of a low-status position in life, right? Interruptions come our way all the time, as Glenn points out, and the reality is whether we act on them or not in our head, it so annoys us. The people in our lives who do the interrupting on us are taking on the mantle, you could say, of high-status position. They are assuming the top rung of the ladder in the hierarchy, even if only temporarily. I mean, think about it for a second. To interrupt someone is to say to them, for this time, for this moment, my agenda, my concerns trump yours. Trump your agenda, your concerns. As Glenn has pointed out, none of us like that. And so to be interruptible is to take a low-status position in life. Basically, I think you could say this: interruptibility is a form of welcome and hospitality. It's a way of making room on our to-do list for others. It's making space so we can slow down and pay attention to others. Consider this quote from Koseki Koyama in his book, Life on the Vine. It says this: God walks slowly because he is love. Love has its speed. It's an inner speed. It's a spiritual speed. It's a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It is slow, yet it is Lord over all other speeds, since it is the speed of love. interruptibility, you could say, is a sign that we're moving at the speed of love. We see this a lot in Jesus' life and ministry. I mean, people frequently are calling to him from the margins. These low-status people are calling to Jesus, and Jesus allows himself to be interrupted, to allow the least of these, the last, the little, the least, to interrupt what he's doing. 2 stories from Mark chapter 10. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. The disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." Second story in the same chapter. Then they came to Jericho as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city. A blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him, told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." I think interruptibility might be the ultimate form of humility. We tend to become uninterruptible when we imagine that our agenda, our concerns, are the top shelf on the hierarchy. And so when you allow someone to interrupt you, you are implicitly setting their agenda ahead of your own. You're practicing, I think, what Paul taught, in humility, value others above yourselves. And I don't think Paul is talking about self-esteem here. He's talking about priorities. Put other people's interests on your to-do list. Be interruptible. And I know the reality is you're thinking, life is full of interruptions. I'm going to get walked over if I'm open to interruptions. Yes, that's the fine line we always walk, right? How do I balance emails and people interrupting me with the things I have to do? But it's a position of humility and spirit to say to others, yes, you are welcome. You can interrupt me. Hopefully you have your journals. I want to close with 3 or 4 reflection questions for you to think about this morning. First would be this. How do you handle yourself in hierarchies? Reality is, I don't think any of us love to be in hierarchies. On a formal level, right, when you're on the phone with the bank or Rogers or who else, it really sucks to be low on the hierarchy ladder, right? But socially, how do we handle ourselves in hierarchies? Take some time to think about that. The second question would be this. Are you willing to submit to community? Are you willing to submit to community, mutual submission? It's interesting. What do I mean by that? Let me just throw out a few ideas here. Traditions like baptism are often parts of communities. And I can imagine some of us thinking here, I would never get baptized. That's such a weird thing to be dunked in water. But traditions and rituals are part of communities. Are you willing to surrender and submit to those? Or think about it, Scripture is a part of communities. Are you willing to submit to that? Not come at Scripture from a power perspective to critique and judge, but allow it to read you, to surrender, submit. Or ask yourself this, how often do we interrupt others in conversations? Think about just the way conversations play out socially. How often are we the ones interrupting others? How do we handle it when other people interrupt us? I mean, what drives it when we interrupt people in conversation? I don't know about you, but I can pinpoint it to about 3 things. The first is, somebody's talking to me, I'm thinking, my agenda is more important, so the moment I get a chance, I'm going to interrupt. Or sometimes it's, my story is more spectacular than their story, so the moment they're done telling their boring story, I'll get in with my really good one. Or sometimes it's, I don't like what they're saying, my intellect is superior, so the moment I can, I'm going to jump in and tell them why they're wrong, right? Why do we interrupt others in conversations? What drives that? Oftentimes it's, I'm here on the hierarchy ladder, you're here, so let me just pipe in. On that same level, how often do we interrupt our children? It was interesting, I was talking to Kevin this week about what we were talking about. He was telling me that he read a study recently that says parents are more likely to interrupt their daughters than their sons. Fascinating, right? What does that say? Whatever it means, we've taken on, whether it's cultural conditioning or some sort of human wiring gone wrong, if we are interrupting our daughters more than our sons, what we're intrinsically saying is, you are low on the ladder. So we interrupt our daughters, we're saying, learn your place in life. as parents, do we need to check? How often do we interrupt our children? You know, it's interesting. Louis C.K., who is incredibly vulgar but really funny, he has this stand-up bit about his 4-year-old daughter, and he says, I could have missed everything my 4-year-old daughter has said, and it wouldn't have changed a thing. Like, nothing she has said has been important. Nothing would change if I'd missed every single word. And it's interesting because it can feel like that, but how often do we let our kids, whether it's valuable or not, how often do we let them go? Think about how you react when you're interrupted. What does that do inside of you? So here's the thing I've come to think. How you answer these questions might actually define the measure of your love far more effectively than any cliche might. I want to ask the band to come right now. Here they come. How you answer these questions, take some time, take your journal, maybe think about it. How you answer these questions might define the measure of your love far more effectively than some cliches about love might. How do we handle ourselves in hierarchies? How do we submit to community? How often do we interrupt in conversations? One of the things I'm thrilled about is when our own community writes their own songs, and John Benjamins did this song a couple weeks ago. But I think part of submitting to one another in community is hearing from them, hearing their songs, engaging, submitting to it. And so as John and the band play this song called The Resistance, I hope that you will allow yourselves to be taken into the song, sing along, whatever you want, but allow yourself to be moved by this piece of music, and then we'll go from here. So this is The Resistance by John Benjamins.